Добрий день, я вітаю всіх, хто приєднався до
Good
нас.
afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Tumanova. It's my pleasure to welcome you at Ukraine Media Center. Our following briefing will be dedicated to our power grid. We will discuss the condition and the challenges and a little bit about the future, I hope. So let me introduce our speaker. Joining us today is Oleksandr, the director of the Energy Industry Research Center. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. So the start of the cold season in Ukraine coincided with another wave of Russian attacks. I think that within the last couple of months, there were dozens of massive attacks. Our gas infrastructure ended up as under bombardments, as well as the thermal power plants. Everything that can be damaged is being damaged with the drones, missiles, and other capabilities of the aggressor. It all resulted in rolling power shutdown schedules. Sometimes the shutdowns are longer, sometimes shorter, but those are the conditions we've been living in, at least within the last month. So, what is the condition of our power grid for the time being, based on the knowledge that we know, the results of the attack that we're aware of? Talking about current condition, now the power grid is being repaired after the attacks. I think that it got a little bit easier, yeah, during the last weekend, and hopefully we will observe positive dynamics this year. The reestablishment of power supply is been on the way when it comes to nuclear power plants. The aerial networks are being repaired, so the process of reestablishment of power supply and repair of the power grid is underway. I would say that if we had 6 to 7 weeks to repair and maintain all of the equipment, we would bring the situation to the condition when we don't need any power shutdowns or to make the minimum. However, I don't think that we can expect anything like this. The situation is under control generally, and those actions that were taken to get prepared to the heating season, now we see they prove to be efficient. The construction of the fortifications of the physical protection demonstrates high efficiency. If I'm not mistaken, this night one of the substation was hit by 6 drones, and it's going to be back in operation like within just couple of days. So there's a minimum damage of the protective elements, and thanks to that, all of the operations can be resumed promptly. The key equipment remained intact, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Being done quite intensely. Talking about gas mining, for what I understand, now Naftogaz is working along two key tracks. On one hand, they contract the additional amounts of gas to make sure that in the end of the winter, in February and in March, we don't face any deficit of pressure in the system. That's way bigger problem than the amount of gas, because to make sure that gas distribution, gas transportation system keeps operating normally, we need to maintain certain pressure. And when the storages are exhausted, this pressure is difficult to achieve. We have to have some amount of national mining or to have some contracts with the West to maintain this level of pressure. So that's a publicly open information that such contracts are being signed. So I feel quite secure when it comes to gas. I don't think there will be any cardinal problems arising. When it comes to generation, obviously the situation on one hand is difficult because there's a lot of attacks, the massive attacks targeting the generation capacities, and obviously when there are 30-35 drones coming to one reactor, it's difficult to protect it with air defense capabilities, and building some physical protection is a bit too costly. So we have a vulnerable spot there. Partly we can compensate it with increase of import. Now we can import up to 2.3 gigawatts of watts of energy, which may come in real handy in critical situation. Obviously, the prices in Europe are way too high. So yesterday, the peak prices in our neighbors were achieving 270 euro per megawatt per hour, which is way higher than the regular prices, like 90, 70 euro inherent in other seasons. So generally, the situation with the power supply looks like the energy won't be cheap. Talking about the regions, there is a feeling that Russia has changed its tactics when it comes to the strikes. And during the last strikes, there were attempts to tear our frontline regions away from power supply. We can observe it in Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Zaporizhia region. What's going on there? We understand that the challenges for those regions are different compared to those that Kyiv region and other regions have. So I would say that Kyiv, Odessa, and frontline areas and borderline areas are in the most difficult situation for the time being. There's a lot of consumption in Kiev and Odessa. There is a focus of attacks specifically on those settlements. The attacks are targeting the Kiev heat distribution networks and aerial power lines feeding both Kiev and Odessa, and now there are massive strikes on the distribution networks in the regions. We were discussing it intensely during our previous briefing here at the media center, but what's happening, the Muscovites in those areas where they can achieve it with short-range capabilities, they attack all of the infrastructure facilities at the depth of 100 kilometers. If previously, for example, no one was paying attention to the 110 or 35-volt substations, now they are being intensely targeted, and at the same time, they remain unprotected. So we have to state that unfortunately this threat, I think that is the Ministry of Energy which should be responsible for that, for initiating the process of preparation of protection in those facilities. But unfortunately, that was not done, and now the government keeps allocating money and urgently developing the plan to protect the distribution network facilities. But no matter how we hurry, any significant protection may appear only next year. So now the regions are suffering, and there are two news about that. One, a good news and bad news. We've heard the good news. Oh, sorry, the bad news. No one was preparing. There are no provisions of equipment. There are no physical protection measures. Now the funds are being urgently allocated. The resources are being allocated to build such protection, to procure the equipment. But one way or another, it takes time. And on the other hand, it's not aerial networks. It's way easier to reconstruct. It's way easier to find equipment. It's way easier to bring and reinstall it, and so on and so forth. It needs to be done, but I can see that now there is a focus. There is work focused on that, and within 2 to 3 months, the algorithm will be developed how to respond to the damage of distribution networks in the regions, but in other regions the situation is different. And if you take a look at the regions along the front line, there are regions that experience a lot of attacks, but the power shutdowns are way shorter there, and the level of problems is way lower there because those regions were prepared. They have provisions of equipment, they have well-trained teams who know what to do, and they have installed minimum protection at their facilities. It's visible on the map. When you check the news, you will understand which regions prepared the best. And now the question is to make sure that the regional distribution companies have some provisions of equipment and understanding of how to reconstruct, how to repair the networks. Well, unfortunately, there is a feeling that the situation we ended up in, like people usually blame bad protection of the bad physical protection of the facilities. Do you agree with that? Where we have the second level protection built by the Agency on Reconstruction and Ukrenergo, there is quite a transparent statistics. There are 74 constructed facilities that were built as of 15th of October. Those 74 facilities, among those 74, there is one automatic transformer destroyed. There was a direct hit by heavy missile that destroyed both protection and the transformer that it was protected. So 98% of the second level protection can be corroborated. And there are examples when one such OO protective facility was withstanding, say, like six attacks. But again, that protection, it protects transformers, important equipment, relays, switches. They can be damaged, but they can be promptly replaced and switched back into operation. Sometimes there are problems caused by cluster munitions, and in that case, we need to wait for the deminers to finalize their work so that the energy technicians get access to the facility and the repair. It takes not a month afterwards, it takes an hour. So the protection itself, in my opinion, works good. I mean, the statistics is it's the fact. It's not an like expert assessment. It's not a forecast. There are 74 facilities, and the results on the strikes inflicted on them. When it comes to absence of protection, yeah, it's a huge problem. Okay, why did it happen? So let's try to explain to our spectators why this protection wasn't constructed equally all across the country or proportionally. Well, look, on the national scale, there were 116 transformers identified by Ukrenergo. They've come up with this initiative. They've identified the transformers. They've sought those transformers to have a protection project developed for them. So 45 more protective structures are being still constructed so far, and they will be finalized just in a couple of months. So when it comes to this part, there is an answer. How it was done, why the rest was not done, please don't ask me because I don't know. Okay, let's try to talk about forecast. I think that this is something of concerns to all of the Ukrainians. We're entering the winter period, and the situation around us is going to become more and more complicated. What should we prepare? I think that the winter will be the same as the last month and a half. There will be massive attacks on a lot of power grid facilities. It will result in problems lasting for 3 to 4 days of sorting out the critical situations. Then there will be partial improvement of situation and then gradual restoration and step-by-step restoration of normal power supply, reestablishment of normal power supply. So in that emergency situation, those 3 to 4 days will be difficult. The emergency shutdowns may last long, but we are not going to lose the manageability of the systems. It's clear what to do. It's clear how to repair and reestablish power supply. I don't think that it's a hell of an effort to take to make steps for them to inflict more damage. They've initiated a couple of waves of attacks, but there was no loss of manageability of the system. There was no panic in the energy sector. Everything keeps operating, everything keeps repairing. Everybody knows what to do, and using the provisions of equipment, we are still able to make it through this period. So I think that unfortunately, this is the way we are going to survive the following winter. Massive attack, 3 to 4 days of restoration, then another big attack. But again, let me repeat myself, within 6 to 8 weeks, we would be able to reestablish normal power supplies. So, from the perspective of the mechanisms, of the equipment, everything that is needed to repair and restore our system, we are prepared. Look, it's like an ambiguous thing. There's no one answer. The electric energy sector was not getting significant international aid starting from September 2024. Any significant extensive aid. At the same time, during this period, somewhere in the middle, from September to say April, energy sector was getting no aid because after the scandal of around the corporate governance in Ukrenergo and because of the weird decisions of Ministry of Energy, Ukrenergo ended up in some very difficult condition. If before that they got 1.5 billion euro of grants, credits, and other money through Ukrenergo, who were a focal point, who would distribute that aid across the sector, then after that, until this day, probably 10 or probably 100 or 110 million of aid was provided, but it was provided in equipment, like something you cannot steal. We're going to give you the equipment to avoid any scandals. Unfortunately, this situation is still in effect in energy sector. Thankfully, the new supervisory council was appointed to Ukrenergo, which allowed procurement of gas for Naftogaz so that we can have excessive gas in the winter. Thanks God, but Naftogaz have their specifics, their own tasks. They cannot be responsible for the rest of the sector, and for the time being, those provisions that were accumulated, well, some kind of fat, we would say, like the transformers, the money for construction of the shelters, procurement of new equipment, those provisions start getting exhausted. 2, 3, 4 more months, and they get completely exhausted. And within Ukrainian energy sector, there is no money. There is only debt. The key points around the debt is Naftogaz, whose debt is 2.5 billion dollars, and we either reestablish the trust through appointment of the new Minister of Energy, probably the settlement of the situation with the corporate governance in the state companies, or we get back to normal cooperation with the donors, to normal trust, and we get significant amount of aid, or otherwise starting from April we will start experiencing problems due to physical absence of necessary equipment and materials for restoration. So we have like 3 months. So it's a little bit too optimistic of an outlook. Hopefully our provisions will be sufficient for the next 3 months. Thank you, dear colleagues. I would like to give you an opportunity to ask your questions. So if you have any, please raise your hands and let me know. Well, now that we're not seeing any questions on the floor, I'm having a question. I don't know whether you're ready to answer it or not, but still, we'll understand that now the shutdowns really influence everything in our country. And first of all, there is an impression that they influence economy significantly. Do we understand this influence? Does anyone Did anyone try to evaluate to what extent those shutdowns influence our businesses, everything that brings money to our budget? Well, the answer to the question is yes. I know for sure that the Center of Economic Survey of Gleb Wishlinsky and relevant center of the National Bank, they work on this issue. We were cooperating, but I'm the wrong person to translate this assessment. There should be a representative of a national bank or Wishlinsky Center to give you some real figures. I provide them with technical information. I help them, but their evaluations are way more competent. Well, sir, I would like to thank you for this broadcast. Thank you for joining us, and I would like to thank you for covering this important topic. And obviously, I would like to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we are here and we can hold events like this. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.